'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick.
Young lady. The court will come to order. Are counsel ready to proceed? This is the matter of the case of Livingston versus Moore. The charge, basically, is that the descendants of Major Henry Livingston Jr. charged Clement Clarke Moore with literary piracy concerning the authorship credit for Account of Visit from St. Nicholas, which is also known as Twas the Night Before Christmas, first published in the Troy Sentinel newspaper on December 23, 1823. Is the jury ready to proceed? Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, please open your programs. If you have a red J on your program, you've been selected as a juror. Please come forward. Please see it in the jury room.
Sally! Oh no! Oh no! We just lost.
We know each other. Oh my goodness.
How did you do it?
Members of the jury, please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that you will try this matter in a fair and impartial manner to the best of your ability to help you God? Yes.
Are counsel ready to proceed?
Ready, Your Honor.
Ready, Your Honor.
Very well. I'll ask that an opening statement on behalf of the Livingston descendants be presented at this time by Mr. Casey.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Jack Casey, and I represent Henry Livingston Jr. We thank you for your attendance here today. What is a poet? Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me standing here, watching his woods fill up with snow. That's a poet. One that April with his shoulders sutta, the drought of March hath passed to Eurota, and bothered every vine and swished the cord, of which fair dew engendered is the floor. A poet. Once upon a time, you dressed so fine, you threw the bums a dime in your prime, didn't you? People call, say, beware, doll, you're bound to fall. We thought they were all kidding you. A poet. 3 different poets. Robert Frost, stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. Geoffrey Chaucer, describing the medieval tableau of going from London to the Canterbury Cathedral and Bob Dylan standing on 4th Street in Greenwich Village. So I ask you again, what is a poet? To me, a poet is a person who has a deep feeling that he or she wishes to communicate to the rest of mankind, and does so through the lens of his or her personality, his or her sensibility, what they believe in, what they stand for, and what they consider most precious. We have a poem here that 191 years ago was published anonymously in the city of Troy. It's called A Visit from St. Nicholas, otherwise known, as the judge told you, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Who wrote it? We don't know.
I do.
We are trying to establish that one of your jurors is married to your
He
client.
doesn't know and I do. The case is over, Judge.
Let him finish.
Who wrote this poem, and how are we going to establish that? Well, there are two ways to establish it. There's form and there's content. Poets use language. They use words for their meter, they use words for their sound, they use words for their rhymes, and they paint these pictures that are individual and very precious to the poet, and which he wishes to communicate to the rest of mankind. But more importantly, there's content.
I'm not sure whether this is an opening statement or an academic lecture, Judge. Let's move on with the case.
Well, I went to university still.
I haven't understood one thing Mr. Casey said so far.
Let's move on, Mr. Casey.
Yes, Your Honor. There is also content, and that's what brings us here today. Who were these men? We have Clement Clarke Moore, a very narrow academic, a very wealthy individual who lived in a 4-story mansion in Chelsea, New York, and separated himself usually from humanity. He was wealthier and above everybody else. And he's laid claim for 150 years thereabouts to authorship of this poem. He was the son of a bishop. He wrote poetry, and most of his poems are lessons in how to behave. And if you don't behave properly, you're going to get punished. There's a snake under every flower in the garden of Clement Moore. Every woman's allure.
What does that mean?
Every woman's allure. Your Honor.
'Twas the night before Christmas and there's a snake under every guard. What are we doing here?
Well, he's proving my case, Your
Let him
Honor.
finish.
Clement Clarke Moore is always trying to impart a moral. He thinks that mankind is evil and needs to be chastised. Henry Livingston, on the other hand.
If he were listening to your opening, he'd really be wishing someone were chastised.
I had this timed. I guess I'm going to be way over. Henry Livingston, ladies and gentlemen. Revolutionary War hero, farmer in Dutchess County, ran a boat livery out into the Hudson, loved the cycles of nature, the tides up and down the river. A man of the earth, a man of the people, a man that put his life on the line and the lives of his family to fight the revolution and make this country free. Henry Livingston was also a poet. He churned out poetry day by day by day, very rarely put his name on it, published enormous amounts of poetry in journals, and never signed them. Henry Livingston was a devoted father. Now, if you look at this poem, what is it? What is this poem a story of? This poem is nothing other than a dad telling his children how their stockings came to be filled the night before. That's what this poem is. Henry Livingston was a devoted father, and the celebrations of the holidays at his farm in Poughkeepsie were legendary in the lower Hudson Valley. He played the fiddle. He loved to dance. The anapestic meter he used in most of his poetry. It was the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was. It's a dancing sort of meter. So if you compare the content of this poem with the rest of his work, the conclusion is inescapable that he wrote it. Think about the men. Think about who they were. Clement Clarke Moore thought everyone, men, women, and even children, were sinners in the hands of an angry God. Henry Livingston saw the goodness of mankind, the innocence of children, and the magic of this life we shared. And that's what he embodied in this poem. So we ask for your attention today to the witnesses that we produce, and we're sure that at the end of this, your verdict is going to be for Henry Livingston.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Now we'll hear from Mr. Jones on behalf of the Moores.
If this case were as complicated as Jack Casey's just made it, Mr. Moore would need a new lawyer. I represent Mr. Moore, and specifically I represent Chris Post, who is a direct descendant of Mr. Moore, who sits at council table with me. Before I begin to talk about the case that Mr. Casey skillfully alluded to talking about, I want to recognize someone in this courtroom who should be recognized because he's one of the greats of our profession, John T. Casey. Trial lawyer, district attorney, county court judge, Supreme Court judge, appellate division judge. His imprint has been in our profession for decades and decades and will last long after he is gone. This courtroom is justly named after him. Now let's talk about the case. This poem was published in the Troy Sentinel in 1823. Mr. Livingston was alive in 1823. In 1823, Mr. Livingston's boats were parked in Troy, New York. Mr. Livingston lived from 1823 to 1828. Did you know that from 1823 to 1828, Mr. Livingston never, ever took credit for this poem? This poem became a classic in 1823. It was repeated throughout the land in the Christmases to come. From 1823 to 1828, Mr. Livingston never said one thing about this poem being his. In 1828, this poem was published in the Poughkeepsie Journal, Mr. Livingston's hometown newspaper. It was published anonymously, as the 1823 poem had been, and as every poem up from 1820 to 1828 had been. But in his hometown journal, did Mr. Livingston take credit for it? Did he claim it as his own? Did any of his children come forward and say, that's my poem, why are you publishing it anonymously? Who gave it to you? Of course not, because he didn't do it. The Troy Sentinel in 1823 was visited by a young woman who lived in Troy. Her children were friends of Clement Moore's children. One of her children had brought back to her a poem that Clement Moore had written. He had written it for his children. He had no intention of distributing it because he had written it for his children. But she brought this poem to her mother. And her mother went to the publisher of the Troy Sentinel and presented this poem to the publisher. And that's how it was published in the Sentinel. Published anonymously. Moore wanted no credit. They didn't identify him. Now, you wouldn't know anything at all about that if I hadn't just told you. Where was any of that information in Mr. Casey's opening?
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
There was no information in Mr. Casey's opening.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Counsel is testifying to matters that are not in evidence and also are wrong.
I'll give him some leeway
They will
in his
be
opening
in evidence,
statement.
right or wrong. From 1828 until Mr. Moore died in 1863, this poem was published every Christmas in most newspapers around the country at that point in time. At no time, while Mr. Moore was alive, did any member, child, grandchild of the Livingston family come forward and say, that's my dad's, that's my granddad's. Not a whisper. It wasn't until years after Mr. Moore had passed away that the Livingston family first claimed, well, that's something we saw many, many decades ago in my father's home. Did you know that the only existing copies of this poem, are in the handwriting and signed by Clement Moore? Did you know that there's not one single copy of this poem in the handwriting of Mr. Livingston? Nothing relating to this poem signed by Mr. Livingston. Of course you didn't know that until just now, because Mr. Casey never talked about it. In 1837, a publisher wrote to Mr. Moore, inquiring as to whether or not Mr. Moore was the author of this now famous poem. For the first time in 1837, Mr. Moore was outed, and he said, "Yes, I am the author." The publisher changed some words, specifically changed one of the reindeer's names when he published that poem after that. The Livingstons are going to make a big deal about the difference between Dunder and Blixen and Donner and Blitzen. It's not a big deal. First of all, the first change was made by a publisher, not by Mr. Moore. Mr. Casey has spent so much time in his legal career in Albany with the legislature that he's mastered the art of historical revision. And that's what you're going to be presented with today. Complete revision of the history of this poem. Ask yourselves, if a person is a published author, a poet, a college professor, a theologian, a father of nine, a grandfather of nine, a philanthropist, someone who's been published widely, and a biblical scholar, a renowned biblical scholar who lived his life in accord with the precepts of the Bible. Would a man like that ever try to perpetrate a fraud on an entire nation? That's just how silly this position is that Mr. Casey and Team Casey are taking here.
You want to wrap it up, Mr. Jones?
Yes, I will, Your Honor. I'm just having so much fun. So, pay attention to what the actual evidence is, because it's going to be what I say.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. He's not sworn.
I've enjoyed our
Sustained.
visit. Merry Christmas.
Ms. Casey, Mr. Casey, you're prepared to call your first witness?
We would call Kathryn Sheehan, Your Honor, to the witness stand. Okay. Would you please state your name and occupation for the record?
My name is Kathryn Sheehan. I'm in Rensselaer County and University of Westboro.
Now, pursuant to those duties, Kathy, do you maintain records?
Yes.
And whereabouts are they?
They are together those are the times.
And were you visited, not by St. Nicholas, but by myself at some point in time looking for certain records with respect to this case?
Yes.
And did you give me certain records?
Yes, I did.
Can everyone hear Ms. Sheehan?
Better?
Try it.
Is that better?
Good.
Okay.
Is that better? I'll show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 1. Does this look familiar?
Yes, it does.
Did you give this to me?
Yes, I did.
Could you tell the jury what this is?
It's a letter that is in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York by Mr. Tuttle, referencing Mr. Luther Holley, who was the editor of the Troy Sentinel, talking about how he obtained the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas.
Thank you. And I'll show you what's been marked as Plaintiffs 2 and ask you if you recognize this.
Yes, I do.
Could you tell the jury, please, what this is?
That would be a copy of the actual poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas.
And those dates on that?
1823 and 1830.
And what, if you know, is the difference between these in a general way?
Well, one by 1830, Myron King had a wonderful broadside on there, but it's not on there.
But that's on the back?
It's on the back.
Okay. There's certain changes that have been made, minor changes?
Very minor.
Okay. And finally, Plaintiffs 3 would this be in your records at the Rensselaer County Historical Society as well?
Yes.
And could you tell the jury what this is?
That's the I can't see from here now. You have to turn around. The 1830 Troy Sentinel broadside and the 1844 poems by Clement Clarke Moore.
Now, 1830 Sentinel broadside, where was that published?
The Troy Sentinel, it was part of the carrier's address. So it was done through the Troy Sentinel. It was given as the newspaper boys would give that out as a yearly gift.
So that was published in Troy, is that
published
fair
in
to
Troy.
say?
Yep.
The
by Mr.
1844 Poems by Moore, where would that have been published?
That was in New York City, I think.
And was that in a newspaper, to the best of your knowledge?
I think it was in a collection that was at the New York Historical Society.
So would it suffice it to say, would the changes that are reflected between 1830 and 1844 been done by Mr. Moore himself?
Could be.
Thank you. May the record reflect, Your Honor, that counsel has graciously stipulated the remaining exhibits, and they would be numbered 4 through 12. They were before the court in the previous trial last year that resulted in a hung jury, so I don't need to go through the exhibits individually. Kathy did provide most of those to us. I guess there's no objection from counsel.
No objection, Your Honor.
And so we ask
Very
that
well.
No objection.
Those items marked plaintiffs 1 through 12 are received in evidence and
And we thank you
marked
for
as
your
such.
attendance here today. I don't know if Mr. Jones has questions. It's his turn now.
Thank you.
Nice try, Jack. Good afternoon, Ms. Sheehan.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jones.
Are there any published copies of the Moore Christmas poem in Moore's handwriting and with his signature?
Yes, and they're
Objection. Which Moore Christmas poem?
Sustained.
We went to school together.
Flattery will get you nowhere.
How many copies of any Christmas poem entitled Night Before Christmas are there in existence, to your knowledge,
Oh, my goodness.
edited by Mr. Livingston?
None that I know of that exist.
And how many poems are there that have Mr. Moore's handwriting on them and signed by him?
I think there are at least 3.
Now, in 1823, when this poem was first published in the Troy paper, in Exhibit 1, just shown to you by Mr. Casey, how did that poem, according to Exhibit 1, get to the Troy Sentinel?
Well, according to Weiss's History of the City of Troy, the published History of the City of Troy, it was first brought by Harriet Butler, who was the daughter of Reverend David Butler from St. Paul's Episcopal Church. They were friends with the Moore family. Matter of fact, Clement Clarke Moore's father was one of the bishops who consecrated St. Paul's Church. So the families were very close. As the story went, she was in Chelsea and heard the poem and brought it back to Troy, and then it ended up at the Sentinel. However, we did find out that through Mr. Holley, who was the editor of the Troy Sentinel newspaper, that he said a Mrs. Daniel Sackett actually delivered the letter to him at the Troy Sentinel newspaper. After doing a little research, we found that Mrs. Daniel Sackett was the Sunday school teacher at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. So it would have been Harriet's Sunday school. She would have been Harriet's Sunday school teacher.
And the link there through both then would be to the Moore family.
To the Moores and the Butler family, exactly.
In 1837, Mr. Moore was contacted by a publisher with respect to this poem. Is that correct?
Yes, Charles Fenno Hoffman.
And tell us, what, if anything, did he do with respect to the names of any of the reindeer in republishing Mr. Moore's Christmas work?
According to what the communication was with Mr. Hoffman, they changed a couple of the names from Dunder to Donner and Blitzen from Dunder and Blixen. Similar.
Was it then, and is it now, uncommon for editors and publishers to change the submissions of a particular author?
Oh, no, it happens all the time.
And of course, we know from letters to the editor, sometimes they barely resemble what was sent to the editor when they are published.
Yes, it
Particularly if they take a stance opposite the editorial page of the newspaper.
It happens.
And it happened here.
And that's handwritten correspondence as well.
Just for the record, let me clarify, Ms. Sheehan. You say that the original piece, the 1823 piece, referred to the last two reindeer as Dunder, D-U-N-D-E-R, and Blixen, B-L-I-X-E-M.
Correct.
Then, by 1844, those two reindeer become Donner and Blitzen, as we know today.
Correct.
Just trying to help.
Had, prior to 1823, Mr. Moore ever, in verse, written about Santa?
Yes, he wrote a poem, a children's anthology that had very much the same flavor. I can't remember the exact title of it, and that is also at the New York Historical Society.
And that was 1 year prior to 1823, correct? 1822.
22 or 21, yeah.
In 1844, Mr. Moore's Christmas poem was published in an anthology of poetry, correct?
Correct.
And the purpose of that publication was poetry for children?
Yes, poetry for the season.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I object.
I'll allow a brief redirect.
I'll show Kathy what is entered in evidence as Exhibit 12 and ask you if you can recognize that.
It's a handwritten copy of A Visit from St. Nicholas.
And is it signed by anyone?
Clement Clarke Moore.
What date was that written?
I'm not sure. This one is not dated.
Was that handwritten copy prepared before or after the 1844 edition of his poetry?
I can't read where it says, if I'm looking for the Dunder and Blitzen, or, oh, here it is. Dunder and Blitzen, so this would be 1844.
This would be after 1844.
Right.
You've testified, I think, that an editor in New York, you believe maybe that an editor in New York had changed the names from the German, the Dutch to a German.
Uh-huh.
In that poem, in his writing, did he change them back to the Dutch?
Oh. No, it says Donder. No, it looks like it says Donder and Blitzen.
So in 1823, it was Dutch. Then an editor took it upon himself to change it to German, but when he rewrote it, he didn't change it back to the way he had originally written it. Correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
One more item, Your Honor. With respect to the Sackett-Butler connection, I believe Mr. Jones testified during his opening.
What's an opening for, Judge?
That the Sackett, that was a child of Daniel Sackett that visited the Moore household, but you're saying that it was a student of Mrs. Sackett.
Yes.
Okay,
Harriet
so
it wasn't
her child.
Right.
So that was an error in Mr. Jones' testimony, and that
And that falsus in uno, falsus in omnes principle means that everything he said during his opening could also be suspected as being untrue. Thank you.
Yeah, but he won't hold that against me.
No further questions.
Anything else, Mr. Jones?
No, Judge.
Call your next witness. Thank you, Ms. Sheen.
Plaintiff calls Pamela McColl to the stand. Hi, Ms. McColl.
Hello.
Can you just give your name and your occupation for the jury, please?
Sure. My name is Pamela McColl. I'm a book publisher and I have a history degree.
And I'm going to show you what's been deemed marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 13. Do you recognize this, Ms. McColl?
Yes, that's the edition of Twas Night Before Christmas I published in 2012 without the smoking.
Okay, now is this book that I'm showing you, Plaintiff's Exhibit 13, is this a version of A Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem that's at issue here tonight?
Yes, it's an edited by Santa Claus version that doesn't have a smoking Santa Claus.
Okay, so can you just,
Of course.
can you reiterate for the jury, what's the difference between this book, Plaintiff's Exhibit 13, and the original version of the poem?
Well, for one, the title, it's a Twas the Night Before Christmas and not A Visit from St. Nicholas. And it has, I think, 13 words edited out by myself, alias Santa Claus, to take out the reference to the smoking pipe and the wreath around Santa's head.
And Ms. McColl, why did you decide to remove the references to smoking from your version of the poem?
I live in the 21st century. It was written in 1822. I think that the damage from tobacco that we all have now witnessed warrants having children protected from the tobacco industry. So I took out smoking. I also very much believe that Clement Seymour, although I don't speak for the dead, I think he would have applauded it.
And did you do any research about Clement Clarke Moore when you were going through the process of publishing this book?
I did. I think I also, when I was lambasted by the American Library Association and called the literary vandal myself, and taken to task by international media and everybody else for having done this to this most famous poem in the English language, I was also told that Clement Seymour would be rolling over in his grave and everything else, and I had hate mail from elves and snowmen and everybody. So I went back to the writings of Clement Seymour, and I discovered that not only did he have a dislike of tobacco, he called it opium's villainous, treacherous friend. This was an extremely pious man, and smoking to him would have been a sin. You certainly wouldn't have been getting any Christmas presents if you were smoking. So I think for this man to have taken out, to have put, the idea that this man would have put a pipe in a story for his children makes no sense to me at all. And so I think that what I did, should I ever meet Mr. Moore in heaven, I think he would say, well done.
Ms. McCall, have you formulated any opinions about the authorship of the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas?
I have. I've read a great deal about Clement
Objection.
Seymour.
Sustained.
Your Honor, she's an expert witness. She's here to testify about the research.
She's an expert witness on smoking.
She's an expert
I
witness
think she
on the
has been
poem.
smoking, Judge.
Ms. McCall published this book. She's an expert on the poem Twas the Night Before Christmas, also known as A Visit from St. Nicholas.
I'm also a publisher, right? I'm also an expert as a publisher, so.
I'll allow it. Go ahead.
Ms. McCall, what's your opinion about the authorship of the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas?
Although I don't think it's appropriate to speak ill of the dead, because I don't think the dead can defend themselves, I think there is enough evidence to put his authorship of this poem in great question. And although I did credit this poem to him on the cover of the book, and I put a portrait of Clement Seymour in the book, I think from the amount of scholarly research I've done on it, I have a very hard time believing he wrote this poem.
Ms. McCall, is your opinion that Clement Seymour did not write this
Objection.
poem? Ms.
Affirmative.
Ms. McCall, is your opinion that you
It may be irrelevant, but I'd like to hear the answer.
Whose side are you on, Judge? Remember the class of 1966 at the law school, you and I together?
The truth will see us through, Mr. Jones.
Ms. McColl, is your opinion that Clement C. Moore was not the author of this poem to a reasonable degree of certainty?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Mr. Jones?
Good afternoon. Until we met this afternoon, you and I had never met before,
True?
never talked before,
No?
correct?
True.
You had met with Mr. Casey prior to today, is that correct?
Yes.
Talked with him prior to today, true?
We were on television together this
And
morning.
on this morning, you were on television together. Scandalous. So how many times have you talked about this book? Where's that book, anyway? This little book here. Did it sell any copies?
Yes, and I won 7 book awards.
Good for you.
And Stephen
Not
Colbert
for-
did a spoof
Not
on
for the
me.
integrity of the work, but its cleverness.
Objection, Your Honor. Close for a conclusion.
A decent
So I
conclusion.
have a question for you. It has to do with smoking.
Sure.
How do you feel about Frosty the Snowman with his corncob pipe and his button nose and 2 eyes made out of coal? Smoking coal? Whoa!
The fact that
Not
I...
good, eh? Is that why he melts? Let me ask you one last question here.
I could answer that one. I can't touch Frosty. He's not in the public domain, but I would if I could.
As we look at this book, can you tell me, the title is Twas the Night Before Christmas, correct?
Correct?
And then right below that it says by Clement C. Moore, correct?
Correct.
And this book was published when?
2012.
Was that only 2 years ago?
Yes.
Very convenient you changed your mind just to serve the purposes of the Casey team here.
No,
You mentioned Clement Moore again in this book?
in the book?
Yeah.
Probably on the front title page.
Is there any reference to Mr. Livingston in this book?
I don't believe there is.
Clement C. Moore, for all the world to see. If you can find Livingston on that cover, I'm retiring. Just because you're Duncan's father doesn't give you a voice. Thank you, it's been a lot of fun. I hope I don't see you again.
Do you smoke?
Thank you, Ms. McColl.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff will consider resting, but I have to confer with my co-counsel. It's on my co-counsel's opinion that we need another witness, Your Honor, but we don't have anybody subpoenaed. So we're going to have to appeal to the other world and ask somebody to come back from the dead.
A ghost, Mr. Casey?
We need a ghostly witness, Your Honor.
I object to any witnesses from the other world, and I have a specific objection, Judge, which I will voice after the violinist comes out.
Don't applaud me, please. Applaud the anonymous tunesmith who passed that delightful melody down through the ages with no thought of fame for himself. Happy Christmas!
Mr. Jones?
The issue, Judge, always in these cases is the reliability of the witness. And the problem with bringing witnesses back from the dead is that there's no incentive for them to tell the truth. Witnesses who are dead are either in heaven, they're in hell, or in their purgatory. And they're not going anyplace else, they're coming back here and testifying. So what incentive is there for this witness to tell the truth when he knows he's going to go back to whence he came from? There's no oath that's going to satisfy the witness. Nicholas.
Mr. Casey, why should we allow a ghost to testify?
Your Honor, this, ladies and gentlemen, is Major Henry Livingston Jr. from the other world.
A far more complicated place than you might imagine.
Could you tell us, are you
Well, let me
above
ask,
us
Mr.
or
Casey.
beneath us, Henry?
Let me ask you. I basically have to make a ruling as to whether or not I'll let a ghost testify. Why should a ghost be allowed to
Well,
testify?
if he's in heaven, he will tell the truth. However, if he's in hell, he'll probably tell a falsity. So I'm trying to ascertain where he resides currently, Your Honor.
Well,
Have you gone upwards, Henry, or have you gone downwards? You look like you've been floating amongst the clouds and not burning in the eternal flame. So please tell this court.
Your Honor, I will withdraw my objection. He's not the first dead witness to testify in the city of Troy.
very well.
Your Honor, if they can vote in Troy, they can testify.
In light of the political and cultural history of this community, I'll allow this ghost to testify. You should be sworn.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do. Or I answer to you.
Major Henry, could you state your name, your place of residence while you were within this mortal coil for the jury?
Henry Livingston Jr., and I lived at Poughkeepsie, New York.
Did you ever serve in the military?
I did.
In what capacity?
I was commissioned as a major in 1775 as the hostilities were beginning.
And which side?
Our side.
Thank you, Henry. So you fought for freedom. Would that be a characterization?
Yes, I did.
You played the fiddle on the way through. Did you play it while you were alive in this world?
Oh, yes, it was one of the great diversions in our household.
What did you do for a living?
Well, I farmed my land, and we had a boat dock supplying provisions and other needs to the passing sailors on the Hudson. And I wrote poetry, though I can't say there was much of a living in that.
I would agree with that. But in any event, with respect to your family, did you have any children?
Yes, I did. I was married twice. 4 children with my first wife and 8 with my second. Unfortunately, I outlived the first 4.
So it's cheaper by the dozen, Henry. Would that be fair?
That's a novel turn of phrase.
Did you ever write poems to delight and entertain your children?
Of course.
Did you ever write a poem about, let's take a stab, St. Nicholas?
Yes, I did.
Could you recite that poem for us today?
It begins, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse."
Henry, can I pause you there? I hear a mouse. I hear a mouse.
I cannot believe what I am hearing. How dare you, sir? Mr. Livingston, I presume. You're sitting there in your little box spewing these fat proclamations.
Madam?
You are not the author of this story, sir. Clement Clarke Morris, and I know because I, Mrs. Daniel Sackett, Sarah Sackett, brought you to the Sentinel. All you men. If it weren't for them, this story wouldn't even be known.
Order in this court, madam. I'm going to direct that the bailiff remove this
Well, I like
person.
her, Judge. I like her. Please don't leave.
Cat. We may be second-class citizens in this country, but we can still walk by ourselves.
Brian's been called much worse, believe me.
May I continue, Your Honor? Henry, before we were rudely interrupted, you were about to recite the poem. I do believe everybody knows the poem sufficiently, so we'll dispense with that. I'll show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 5 and ask if you could read us a couple of excerpts from that. Henry, would you please read the last 2 stanzas of that poem?
I didn't write this.
Do you know who did?
But where I found the children naughty, in manners rude, in temper haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swearers, boxers or cheats or base tale bearers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. That's terrible. It's
What does
so
that refer
mean.
to, Henry?
I'm sorry?
What does that refer to?
Objection, this is irrelevant.
Again, it's very interesting.
He didn't write the poem. He didn't write the poem.
Henry, do you know who did write the poem?
I do not.
Oh.
But I believe that this...
No, that's so
Yes!
I believe this.
I will. Now, we haven't had a ghost expert here in years, so I'm not going to allow him to testify to that.
Okay. I can connect that later with a witness that I expect to be called. Thank you, Henry. With respect to your poetry, would you ever write anything like this?
No.
Why not?
Well, I'm trying to get away from the thoughts that are contained therein. That's really coming from the tradition of the old Germanic Krampus and Saint Nicholas, the good and the punishment that used to be the way Christmas was perceived. I'm trying to celebrate the joy and the love of Christmas.
And where were you trying to celebrate that?
Well, in my poetry, which is, by extension, my household.
I'll show you what's been marked and entered into evidence as Plaintiff's 8 and ask you if you will read the highlighted sections of that poem. Well, first of all, do you know who wrote that poem?
Yes, I wrote this one.
Thank you.
This
Could
was
you
to
read
my,
the highlighted sections,
to my
please?
brother, Beekman. Then bounce all hands to Fishkill must go in a clutter to guzzle Bohea and destroy bread and butter, while you at New Lebanon stand all forlorn behind the cold counter from evening to morn. The old tenor merchants push nigher and nigher, till fairly they shut out poor Bays from the fire. Out, out, my dear brother, Aunt Amy's just come with a flask for molasses and a bottle for rum. Run, help the poor creature to light from her jade. You see the dear lady's a power afraid. Souse into your arms, she leaps like an otter and smears your new coat with her piggin of butter.
Didn't the Beatles put that to music?
Yes. And Henry, one last one. I'm going to show you Plaintiff's 9 and ask you to read the 2 highlighted lines in that poem.
This is from another verse of mine. Well, madam, the long and the short of the clatter, for mumbling and mincing will not better the matter.
So I do have one further poem, which entered into evidence as Plaintiff's 10. Could you tell us the author of that poem, if you know?
Oh, that's another verse of mine. I'm impressed that they've so persevered. I titled this Careless Philosopher's Soliloquy.
Could you read it for the jury, please?
I shall. I rise when I please I lie down, nor seek what I care not a rush for, renown. The rattle called wealth I have learnt to despise, nor aim to be either important or wise. Let women and children like men, pursue the false trollop the world has called fame, who just as enjoyed is instantly flown, and leaves disappointment the hag in her room. If the world is content not to stand in my way, the world may jog on both by night and by day, unimpeded by me. Not a straw will I put where a dear fellow creature uplifteth its foot. While my conscience abrades not, I'll rise and lie down, nor envy a monarch his cares and his crown.
Thank you, Henry.
My pleasure.
With respect to notoriety and literary fame, what is your position? As expressed in that poem, and also, what is your belief?
I believe that the verses I wrote were meant to be shared with those who would enjoy them, but I never sought to, bring any kind of credit to myself. That just seemed too distracting.
Did you ever publish publicly in journals?
Yes, yes.
Did you ever sign your poetry that you published in journals?
I did not.
Why not?
again, I didn't seek that kind of notoriety.
Henry, do you recall when you left this earth?
It was a tumultuous occasion.
As Judge Dwyer once said, it was an awesome occasion, one I'd never care to repeat. I'll show you what's been marked finally as Exhibit 7 and ask if you can identify this. It's already been referred to in the testimony of Mr. Jones.
This is the Poughkeepsie newspaper.
And you testified you lived in Poughkeepsie, correct?
That's correct.
What's the date on that newspaper?
January 16, 1828.
So, can you tell
I hadn't much time to go.
And when did you pass away?
Just a few weeks later.
And being in Poughkeepsie, did you die in Poughkeepsie?
Yes, I did.
And that poem was published in January. And what is that poem about?
It's a visit from St. Nicholas about Christmas.
So a Christmas poem was published 3 or 4 weeks before you died in your hometown. Why?
I believe it was meant as a gesture from my children, as a sort of goodbye.
Was that poem signed?
No.
So the fact that it was published in your hometown and you didn't take credit for it, as alluded to by opposing counsel's opening statement, does not reflect that you weren't the author.
That I'm not? No.
You did author that poem?
Yes.
Do you know which reindeer you put in that poem in the Poughkeepsie Journal?
The reindeer listed here. Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Dunder, and Blixen.
Blixen?
Yes.
And that would be German or Dutch?
Dutch.
Did you ever change the names of your reindeer to German?
No. It would be, it would go against the rhyme scheme.
Oh, the rhyme scheme. How would that happen?
Well,
let me show you Plaintiff's Exhibit 3, and maybe you can elucidate that for the jury.
If I don't wish to grow tedious for obviously a very polite group of people, but I wrote the poem in what's called anapestic tetrameter, which simply means it has the rhythm ta-ta-ta, 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 ta-ta-ta. However, one doesn't adhere slavishly to those rhythms necessarily. You want to produce more interesting effects, and that results in what are called catalectic lines. But I don't want to get into that too much. As for the reindeer, this is changed to German. This is the Dutch. You see, it's meant to rhyme with vixen. And a vixen, as a word, is a trochee. It has a stress on the first of the two syllables. And rhyming takes place against the final stressed syllable of a line. Not necessarily the last syllable, the last stressed syllable. That would be vix, vixen. So blix, blixen. Now it's a somewhat weak ending word, but blixen rhymes with vixen. Blitzen does not.
Blitzen does not rhyme with vixen?
No.
Oh, I believe Mr. Moore thinks it does, but perhaps we'll hear from somebody on his side. Thank you for your testimony, Henry, and I would ask my opposing counsel if he has any cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, compare heaven and earth to us. How's it going down here now that you come back?
Well, I will say that I probably won't stay here terribly long.
Certainly not after this testimony. So, obviously you've been doing your homework up in heaven. You came down roughly how many days ago?
Oh, time doesn't exist as there's no temporal construct in the place where I've been.
I assume you've not been able to communicate with Mr. Casey from heaven.
Correct.
Because those quarters for Mr. Casey have long ago shut down.
The court will take judicial notice.
I'm going to object, Your Honor.
So you passed to heaven in 1828.
That is correct.
From 18
1828 until a couple of days ago, when you came back here, how much time have you spent viewing Night Before Christmas?
Well, as I say, it's very difficult to put a timeline to that because time simply ceases to exist. So it's something, however, that I think because it meant so much to me while I was here on earth, that there's a quality about it that has informed me into eternity.
Can we agree that from 1823, when this poem first appeared in the Troy Sentinel, until 1828, when it appeared in the Poughkeepsie newspaper, your hometown newspaper, you never claimed credit?
Correct.
In 1828, when the poem appeared in the Poughkeepsie newspaper, roughly a month after Christmas, Poughkeepsie's always 1 month behind us.
You've been there.
You didn't take credit for it then either.
Correct.
You're aware that Mr. Moore lived roughly 35 years after you passed away. You're also aware that during that 35-year period, this poem was published around the world on a regular basis, Christmas.
That's very gratifying to hear.
And that it became one of the most famous poems in all of the world, recognized by people all over the world.
Then I have more than accomplished my purpose.
And from 1928 until Mr. Moore passed away in 1828 to 1863, you are aware that no one bearing your name ever claimed credit for this poem. True?
Well, they're following in my footsteps, and I'm gratified.
Those are big footsteps.
Thank you.
It wasn't until after Mr. Moore passed away and could no longer personally refute any claims of authorship by anyone else that anybody stepped forward and sought credit for this poem. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of it now.
Is it fair to say that you don't know of any document bearing this poem on it in your handwriting?
Well, I can't say that during my lifetime I took very good care of any of my manuscripts, unfortunately.
You have a pretty broad view when you're up in heaven. As you look down upon us here on earth from heaven, have you ever seen a copy of this poem in your handwriting?
Well, where I am is a very distracting place. I can't say we spend much time, such as it is, contemplating what's going on here.
Well, you've known you were coming down here to visit with us for several days anyway. Did you take it upon yourself to investigate whether or not there was any existing copy?
I know of none.
You know of none?
None in no holographic copies.
You've told all of us in this courtroom that you seek no credit for this poem you claim to have composed, as Mr. Moore sought no credit for the poem that bears his name. If you seek no credit, then what are your relatives doing going after Mr. Moore and his family and his authorship?
That's an excellent question. And I have to say, if this means so much to Mr. Moore, well, then he should have the credit. It doesn't matter to me. However, I am moved by the evident fact that I have family members to whom this does matter a great deal, such as sitting just here. And it is for their sake that I would certainly assent to the proper authorship being recognized.
This is why you never ask a why question in a real trial.
This isn't a real trial?
Mr. Livingston, I wish you a speedy return. Have a good afternoon and Merry Christmas.
Happy Christmas to you. Thank you.
A couple of questions on this direct, Your Honor. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Mary Van Dusen, a lineal descendant of the Livingston family. And they are representing the Livingston clan, and they're very gratified that their ancestor was on the witness stand just now. The poem was published not by you, isn't that correct?
Correct.
Okay. In 1823 here in Troy.
That's correct.
And you died in 1828.
Yes,
You never took credit.
that is correct.
Did Clement Moore ever take credit between 1821 and 1828?
Not to my knowledge.
To your knowledge, when was the first time he did take credit?
I'm really not aware of any such.
If I told you Mr. Jones testified that he took credit in 1837 through an author in New York City, would you agree?
All right, yes, certainly.
And so not till 1844 did he actually take credit himself. So, no one was really taking credit for this poem all that time. Do you know when the autograph was prepared by Clement Moore in his own handwriting?
I do not.
Okay. No further questions. Henry, Godspeed, back to God. Tell everybody up there we'll see them sometime soon.
I don't think you're going to see them, Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Livingston. So nice to see you. Anything else, Mr. Casey?
Your Honor, the jury's going to hear from you, I believe, that the burden of proof here is by a fair preponderance of the evidence, which is about 51%. The scales of justice just have to tip a little bit. We have proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond all cavil. We have proved that Henry Livingston, from his own lips...
This is not, he asked you.
I'm about ready to rest, Your Honor.
Is that a summation?
Yes, not a summation yet. Maybe Mr. Jones has a witness, but I can't conceive of who he would ever think to call. So, on that basis, Your Honor, the plaintiff will rest.
Mr. Jones?
Your Honor, I would like to call the young lady who visited with us during Mr. Livingston's testimony. She hasn't left the courtroom yet. She is present, and I'd ask her to take the stand.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I don't believe she has...
You want me to testify?
I sure do, baby.
I don't think it's proper for a woman to testify. I mean, we can't even own property or vote. How can I testify?
If you can vote in Troy, you can testify.
We can vote?
Have a seat, Ms. Sackett.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome back. Tell us how you happen to be here.
Well, I was sitting up on my cloud and talking to a lovely woman named Susan B. Anthony, she was telling me all about her fascinating life and how she visited Troy in 1959 to give a speech, and suddenly I heard these words coming up that Henry Livingston Jr. was the author of The Night Before Christmas, and I know that to be an untruth, so I felt it my duty to come down.
Tell us what you do know about The Night Before Christmas and its authorship.
Well, I teach Sunday school at St. Paul's, and one of my students brought this lovely poem to me. She'd written it in her commonplace book after visiting the Moores. They were family friends, you see. And she told me Mr. Moore read her this poem, and she asked if she could write it down in her commonplace book. She brought it to me, and I, with great foresight, seeing how wonderful and charming it was, I went straight away and brought it to the Troy Sentinel. Well, you see, it was because of me that it's published.
The poem that you brought to the Troy Sentinel was the poem that was published in the Troy Sentinel in 1823.
That is correct, sir.
And that poem came from Mr. Moore, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And you are here from heaven.
Yes.
And you understand that if you don't tell the truth, you may not go back to heaven.
Oh, of course.
And so what you told us is the truth.
Yes.
You're beautiful, baby.
Ms. Casey?
Woman on woman, it's going to be a cat fight.
What's a cat fight?
Mrs. Sackett, did you personally know Clement Clarke Moore?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm quite distracted. You seem to have forgotten your petticoat and skirt, dear.
Oh, excuse me, I must have left it at home.
What was the question again?
Did you personally know Mr. Clement Clarke Moore?
No, I did not know him personally.
Had you ever been to his house?
No.
Have you ever talked to him about the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas?
No.
Did he ever tell you he was the author of the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas?
No.
Have you ever seen a copy of that poem written in his hand?
No.
Have you ever seen a copy of the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, with Mr. Moore's name on it?
No, I have not.
Okay. So you don't actually know whether Clement Clarke Moore was the original author, do you?
Well, I was told so by my student who had visited him, and I have no reason to disbelieve her.
Your Honor, I move to strike the witness's answer. It's hearsay.
Mr. Jones?
Well, Your Honor, she's here from heaven. Hearsay doesn't apply to witnesses from heaven.
I'll allow it. I'll allow it to stand and let the jury consider that comment.
Thank you, Mrs. Sackett.
Oh, you're welcome.
Anything else, Mr. Jones?
I don't think you'll see Mr. Livingston back in heaven.
Oh, well, that would be a blessing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sackett. Mr. Jones?
Your Honor, I am attempting to conjure up another witness from another world.
Another ghost?
Jingle, jingle, here we go. All right. May I introduce Mr. Moore?
Slacks and handcuffs. It gets worse every year.
Mr. Casey? Any objection to Mr. Moore, the ghost, testifying?
I think, Your Honor, he's actually going to help our case, so we have no objection.
If you could come before the clerk, Mr. Moore.
Certainly, Judge. Offer swearing. I never travel without my own good book. I do so solemnly swear that the testimony I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Welcome back to Earth.
Good to see you, Your Honor.
Mr. Moore, you're well known to everybody in this courtroom, but for the record, you better tell us who you are and how you've come here.
Certainly, Mr. Jones. Clement Clarke Moore. My time on this plane began in 1779, ended 84 years later in 1863.
Tell us a little bit about that time on this planet.
It was joyous, very interesting time. I was born in New York, lived my whole life there, married a wonderful woman named Kathryn. We had, 9 children, though 7 survived. My wife Kathryn passed away in 1830, and after her passing, I took it on myself to raise the children, and later, my grandchildren.
How many grandchildren you had?
I had 7 grandchildren.
What did you do?
Well, I studied originally at Columbia. I was a scholar of sorts of what we called Oriental literature, really ancient tongues. My father had been a minister, lovely man of the cloth, yes. And I worked as a professor part-time, and after my wife passed, I only worked intermittently while I raised my children.
You are of Germanic descent?
I am, sir.
And your wife?
Dutch.
Was she an influence on you in your work?
Oh, certainly. She was an influence in every part of my life.
Dutch heritage was important to you in your work?
And to my children, sure, yes.
Did you write any poetry?
Oh, I wrote lots of poetry, Mr. Jones, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I don't think it was particularly good, but I would write poems when inspired and For my children, most often, yes.
I want to bring you forward to 1821-22. Do you recall in that period writing in verse form a letter to Santa Claus for the benefit of your children?
Oh, very well. It turns out that despite all of my scholarly pretensions, that I became best known for something I scribbled away on Christmas Eve in 1822, yes.
And in 1823, a poem was published in the Troy Sentinel entitled, to shorten it up, The Night Before Christmas.
Yes.
What do you know about that?
Well, I never knew exactly how it was published in the Troy Sentinel. But the year earlier, in 1822, my wife sent me out on Christmas Eve to fetch the Christmas turkey. And as I returned from Greenwich Village, I looked at my driver. And oddly, he looked a lot like Livingston, who I just saw moments ago. Roly-poly, merry fellow, and Dutch, I believe. And all of a sudden, Mr. Jones, I had an epiphany. My friend Washington Irving was right, that Christmas should not be about the aristocracy. Christmas should be egalitarian. It should be for all classes. And it was his writing and places I had visited, conversations with my children, and that image that evening of my driver, backlit in the moonlight with the snow falling, that inspired me to go home and write like I had never written before.
And the end result was what?
Well, it was that poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas.
When it was published in the Troy Sentinel in 1823, it did not bear your name.
No, it did not.
In the years that followed, up until 1837, when it was published around the world, it did not bear your name.
That is correct, sir.
And what happened in 1837 that changed all of that?
There had been this, shall we say, a game of cat and mouse going on amongst some of my friends, teasing me about having written that poem, knowing full well I was rather embarrassed, having never attained any of the recognition, I suppose, I'd sought as a scholar. Someone spilled the beans in 1837, yes.
And you were outed. You became known as the author of that poem.
Well, certainly the number of people who associated me with that poem at that time did increase, yes. I was outed, as you say.
In 1844, you published an anthology of poetry principally for children. Is that correct?
My children, yes. They importuned me, actually, to finally publish a collection of poems that I had written to them over the years, probably 35 in all, but it was the Visit from St. Nicholas that they wanted me to include. They were proud of that poem. They were proud of their father. So I acceded to their wishes, and I published that under the volume Poems.
Until your death in 1863, to your knowledge, had anyone else ever claimed authorship of that poem?
No, not to my knowledge.
Had anyone ever challenged you as the author of that poem?
No, my friends teased me relentlessly, but no one challenged me, no.
Let me come directly to a couple of criticisms that the Team Casey have made here today.
Surely.
There were changes between the original poem in 1823 and the poem that was published in 1830 and again in 1837 and again in 1844. Tell us about that. What role, if any, you played in that?
Oh, very little. I don't have any specific recollection of ever making actual changes in it. What happened, Mr. Jones, was that poem was passed around from person to person and place to place, and different editors in different places might make a change here and there. I had no quarrel with that.
You were a published author on many levels and many fields at that time. Is that a fair statement?
That is true, sir.
And in your experience as a published author, was it common for editors and publishers to alter the works that were submitted to them?
Oh, they're ruthless. Yes, absolutely, sir.
Team Casey, through a witness, has criticized the inclusion in your poem of reference to the little elf, Santa the little elf,
right,
smoking, having a pipe and having a smoke like a wreath around his head. Tell us about that inclusion in your poem and why you put that there.
Well, we could scarcely have a Christmas poem proper without a wreath, could we? And I must say I was struggling to find something that was going to rhyme properly with wreath, and then I set on to teeth. And as I thought more, I said, what if he had a short, stubby pipe, right? Like those that were ubiquitous in the working class. That could have been a signal to all that we were moving away from the stern, magisterial bishop image of St. Nicholas and down towards something that was far more egalitarian and democratic that everyone could participate in.
No other reason.
For including a wreath? No, there's no other reason.
Were you, during this period of time in your life, opposed to smoking?
Oh, yes, I was. Tobacco.
Did you see any conflict, any negativity in your inclusion in a poem for children of reference to that pipe and a circle of smoke in the form of a wreath?
No, I think smoking was so commonplace I never gave it another thought. I mean, Santa was a bit overweight, too. It wasn't just the smoking, I suppose.
The names of the reindeer.
Yes.
Tell us about the original names, how they were incorporated into the original poem that you created, and the way in which the names of Dunder and Blixen changed over time.
Right, in the original, I incorporated a phrase that my wife had used. It was on the fence. Dunder and Blixen means thunder and lightning. It was a favorite expression of hers, I can tell you that. And then later, as we were publishing it finally, I was always uncomfortable about how it rhymed. So we changed it to the Germanic. Dunder, Blitzen.
Lastly, there has been comment that the verse which you employed in this poem was not verse that you used. Therefore, it couldn't have been your creation. Do you want to address that?
Well, on Weather with Ease, I with that meter write, I would offer this verse right now in plain sight. Though falsehoods he offers, and makes with a shout, on this point, Mr. Casey, though mighty, strikes out.
Who authored The Night Before Christmas?
I did, Mr. Jones.
No further questions.
Mr. Casey.
Dr. Moore, it is so wonderful of you to be here this afternoon. I'm a little confused, however. Not to belabor the point, but you testified that you wrote it first in Dutch, Donner and Blixen?
Donder.
Donder and Blixen, because that's a phrase your wife used.
Yes.
Okay. And that's what appears in the 1823 Troy Sentinel.
I believe so.
Plaintiff's Exhibit 2. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And then you changed it to German because you liked the way it rhymed better.
Yes, that's correct.
But you said that editors in that era used to change poems when they were published in the books, in the journals, right?
That was the common practice, yes.
And Mr. Jones testified earlier that an editor had changed it from Dutch to German. So did the editor change it, or did you change it?
I really couldn't say. All I can tell you is that the manuscript that I changed for my publication in 1844, I made sure it had Donner and Blitzen.
Dunder and Blixen, 1830, excuse me. Donder and Blitzen. Donder and Blitzen. Does, in your immense poetical taste, Blitzen rhyme with vixen?
Yeah.
I would say no further questions, but he just opened up a whole new area. You've said the word egalitarian about 3 times. What do you mean by that?
I mean that all people should be able to celebrate Christmas and have it being a unifying experience.
And so when you wrote this poem, you were really making a social statement about how America should operate. Is that correct?
I was modeling my beliefs for my children, Mr. Casey.
I see. Isn't it true that you were one of the wealthiest individuals in New York City while you were alive?
For a time.
And didn't you live in a 4-story mansion in Chelsea?
I did.
How much charity work did you do during that period of time, other than the turkeys that you said that you delivered when you had this epiphany? How egalitarian were you, Dr. Moore, other than your poetry?
I did the best I could, Mr. Casey.
So you reflect the lower orders by their ingestion of tobacco. Would that be fair to say?
Could you ask that question again, please?
You take a bow to the lower orders because the aristocracy thinks that tobacco is an evil, but you say, I'm going to put a pipe in Santa Claus' teeth as a doffing of your cap to the lower orders.
Not at all, Mr. Casey. The type of pipe I mentioned was a nod toward the ubiquity of a stub pipe in the working class. That's all.
Well, then I have a question, and I'm sure it's on everybody in this room's mind. It's been on my mind since I was this high, and that man used to read this poem to me. What is a sugar plum?
It's a type of fruit.
A fruit?
This has to do with me being outed.
If they're dancing sugar plums, yes. Can you answer the question, what is a sugar plum?
I did answer that question.
It's a fruit. I see. What does it mean by saying sugar? Is it sugared? Is it a candy? Or is it something that comes off of a tree?
It's just a phrase that I used, Mr. Casey. I can't recall with particularity.
Ooh. Now, do sugar plums dance?
They did that night.
That's where thunder and lightning came from, Judge.
So noted.
You've talked about being embarrassed because your friends ridiculed you for writing this poem once you were outed. Were you embarrassed by this poem?
Not really.
Did you take immense satisfaction of it?
Over time, more and more, it grew and grew in popularity.
So for 21 years, you were the anonymous author, and then all of a sudden, 1844, years and years after poor Henry went to his reward, you finally say, I'm going to take credit for this, and then your friends started to ridicule you. Was that the time sequence?
No, there were people who understood I had written it before, but the circle grew much larger after 1837. In 1844, my children importuned me. They said, Father, it's time.
Isn't it true that this poem found its way into your household through a governess? You didn't write this poem at all, did you?
No, Mr. Casey, that's a falsehood.
Okay, then I'll ask you an artistic question. You've testified here under oath before a judge and a jury that you had an epiphany on the way to get turkeys in Greenwich Village.
Right.
How long did it take you to write the poem?
Probably 3 hours.
A 56-line poem that is the most respected and loved poem in the English language took you a mere 3 hours to write. And you want the jury to believe that?
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it just flowed so easy.
Well, it didn't flow very easily other times, did it? This is the only poem that you wrote in anapestic meter, isn't it? Other than the one where you castigated Casey at the back.
There was one other time, perhaps, I didn't pay too much particular attention to which meter I was writing in, but there was one other, Pig and Rooster, I believe.
Ah, so you wrote one other poem in anapestic meter, and then all of a sudden, an epiphany, a moon, turkeys, a Dutch driver of your sleigh, and you sat down in 3 hours and cranked this out.
It's the easiest meter to use, Mr. Casey.
I see. Are you proud of having written this poem now?
Sure.
Yeah, I believe you testified that you wrote it like you'd never written before. You told Mr. Jones that when you got home, you wrote like you'd never written before.
That's right.
Did you ever write like this again?
In what way?
56 lines in 3 hours.
I couldn't say. I had good days and bad days, but that was a good day.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Anything else, Mr. Jones?
Anything else, Mr. Moore? Anything else, Mr. Moore?
Mr. Jones, I've been a bit perplexed as to why I was summoned from the great beyond to address something that had been so long settled, but I think I have a clue now.
And that clue would be?
It has to do with Mr. Casey. Now, he's a fine man.
He's still fighting class warfare for the Irish, though.
He's a fine man, Mr. Jones, with eyes much inclined for a joke. But in a loud, solemn voice, Mr. Casey, he spoke, "Twixt Moore and my client is cause to decide." But I think that his prompt is professional pride. He obscures the true story, yet this much is true. He'd give up his eye teeth for a chance to meet Stew.
With that, I rest and say amen.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Are counsel prepared for closing arguments?
I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You've been here with me for the last hour and a half. There's nothing I can tell you now that you haven't already heard, both in opening and through the witnesses. But I do want to share a couple of things with you. One, my socks. My pants and my tie. And I bring this to your attention because this is traditional Christmas. Red socks, pants, tie. And this poem is historical tradition. It is vitally important to the city of Troy that this poem be recognized for what it was recognized as back in 1823. To distort and disrupt the historical rhythm by concluding that Mr. Moore is not the author of this poem would do irreversible long-term damage to the psyche of this city, whatever that psyche might be. I don't want to disappoint the Livingstons. Certain Mrs. Van Duzen's come all this way. So I have a suggestion for you. that you agree to disagree, that you have another hung jury. That way, no one wins, no one loses. That way, we come back again next year and do it all over again. Pay careful attention to the Casey summation. The more time they spend on it, the more desperate these evidences they are. Don't let them talk any longer than I just did.
Ms. Casey.
Thank you, Your Honor. When this poem was first published anonymously in the Troy Sentinel, the editor of that newspaper had this to say about it. There is, to our apprehension, a spirit of cordial goodness in it, a playfulness of fancy, and a benevolent alacrity to enter into the feelings and promote the simple pleasures of children, which are altogether charming. Now, you had a chance to see Mr. Moore here tonight, the man who for 2 centuries almost was falsely credited as the author of this poem. He's the steely, rigid, biblical scholar. Now, Mr. Moore did write a poem about Santa Claus, and you heard that today too. And in that poem, Santa Claus differentiated between the good little girls and boys and the bad girls and boys. He made a moral judgment about these children, and the bad kids, even if they were just a little loud, they got long black birchen rods from Santa Claus. And not only that, but their parents were encouraged to beat them with those rods. There's nothing playful about that. Beating your children is pretty much the opposite of promoting children's simple pleasures, wouldn't you say? That poem was not anonymous. That poem was written by Moore, and there's no question about that. Now let's compare that with the poem at issue here today. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And then describing Santa Claus, he was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. And I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. Now, if Mr. Moore is such a biblical scholar, would he take a saint and turn him into a jolly little elf? I don't think so. The Santa Claus in the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, Livingston's Santa Claus, he filled the stockings with treats for the children. He didn't differentiate between the good kids and the bad kids. He made the parents laugh in spite of themselves. He didn't encourage them to beat their children. I want you to ask yourself, could the same man have written those 2 poems? The answer to that question is no. You know it, I know it, and Clement Clarke Moore knows it too. Now, you also had the chance to meet Henry Livingston tonight, the jovial, good-natured gentleman farmer. His twinkling eyes, his merry dimples, his cheeks like roses, mouth like a cherry. He wrote poems for children. He wrote poems for his family. He wrote poems to make the world happy. He didn't write poems to teach lessons, and he didn't write poems for fame. Now, I also want you to pay attention to the styles that these poems were written in, and we talked about that today too. I have a poem written by Henry Livingston, which he didn't read on the witness stand tonight. I'll read you an excerpt. Such gadding, such ambling, such jaunting about, to tea with Miss Nancy, to sweet Willie's rout, new parties at coffee, then parties at wine. Next day, all the world with the Major must dine. Then you have a poem by Moore. Amid life's wreck, we struggle to secure some floating fragment from oblivion's wave. We pant for somewhat that may still
Judge?
endure.
I didn't see this in evidence.
And snatch at least a shadow from the grave.
Recitation.
Well, he's trying to snatch a shadow from the grave tonight.
There's absolutely no authentication of this. I think this was made up by Jack Casey that she's now reading, attributing it to Mr. Moore.
Well, her father's a poet. I'm looking through the exhibits to see Ms. Casey. I don't see any.
Your Honor, this poem is in evidence, and I don't know the title of it off the top of my head, but that poem is one of the exhibits that is in evidence.
I do. I see that paragraph. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Authored by Jack Casey.
Now, if I may resume, I know you've been given an instruction by the court that you're not allowed to do any independent research as jurors. But I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if you were to go out and you were to read every single poem that was written by Henry Livingston, and every single poem that was written by Clement Clarke Moore, and you paid attention to the meters and the rhyme schemes, the cadences of those poems, the syllables, you would see...
Objection that all the poems written by Moore, all the poems written by Livingston, none of that is in evidence.
There are several poems in evidence,
Yeah,
Your
not
Honor.
all of them, and you're asking to read all of them.
There are at least a couple.
Yes.
From each author. And I think it's fair comment.
Miss Casey's learned very quickly at her father's knee. She's exaggerating all the time as she talks.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you went out and you read all those poems, you wouldn't have any doubt that Henry Livingston is the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas. You'd really have to strain your rationale to find very many similarities at all with Moore's other work. And I'd also like to just draw attention to the fact that the only copies of A Visit from St. Nicholas written in Moore's hand were after 1844. Anyone could have copied it. Now, you also heard from Pamela McColl today. She's our expert witness. She's an anti-smoking advocate, a smoking cessation advocate. She took smoking out of this poem because she felt strongly about smoking. Now, you also heard that Clement Clarke Moore was avid, vocal, anti-smoking advocate. A man who hated smoking, would he have taken the hero of a children's poem and made him a smoker? No. It's another example of how Clement Clarke Moore's story and his case just doesn't add up. You can rely on Ms. McColl as an expert. Moore didn't have an expert. The only thing supporting Moore's case is his own self-serving claims. Well, and those of Mrs. Sackett. You also heard from Mrs. Sackett. She was here today. She came back from the dead to tell you all about how she was the reason the poem was published. She was the only reason that made it into the newspaper. She had absolutely nothing probative to offer at all. She told you that she got the poem from one of her students, and that was all she was able to tell you about it.
What does probative mean?
Now, ladies and gentlemen, for some reason, after all of these years, we don't know the reason, for some reason this poem was attributed to Clement Clarke Moore somewhere along the line. We don't know why. You heard all this evidence here today, still weren't able to answer it. After 21 years after this poem was published, Clement Clarke Moore made a furtive inquiry of the editor of the newspaper to make sure that no author had come forward. And he did that so that he could misappropriate this poem with impunity. Literary piracy at its finest, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Moore wanted to make sure that he didn't get caught. And he didn't during his lifetime. But now, 160 years later, you have the ability to set this right. You heard the evidence. You know that Henry Livingston wrote this poem. And you honor his memory and his reputation with your verdict in his favor tonight. I want to thank you for your service, and I want to thank you for doing the right thing, finally.
Now it's my turn to address the jury. This decision is yours. It's not mine. It's not anyone else in this room. It's not Mr. Casey's, Ms. Casey's, or Mr. Jones's. It's your call. I remind you that comments that have been made by the attorneys as to what the evidence is in this case is nothing that you should follow. The evidence that you does that mean there's an imbalance as to who said what? The evidence that you should consider is the evidence that came from the witnesses on the witness stand. I note that ghosts did appear today, and I allowed that. I had very little to do with them being here today, but I did allow their testimony. As unusual as that is, you can consider their testimony along with the testimony of the other witnesses. In order to determine who wins in this case, if you do make a choice that one side prevails over the other, you have to make that decision based on a fair preponderance of the evidence. And that basically means that you all talk it over and you decide who wins. Again, nobody else will be charged with that. 5 out of 6 of the jurors have to agree on a verdict. And that means that if only 4 of you can agree, then there will be no verdict. It will be a, I guess you would call it, as some people have referred to it, as no verdict at all. Again, 5 out of 6 have to agree on what the verdict is. Who wrote The Night Before Christmas? Mr. Livingston or Mr. Moore? That is what I charge you to determine, and I leave that up to you. I will provide you during your deliberations with the exhibits, and they are in this file. Thank you. Go deliberate.
Decorations of red on a green Christmas tree won't be the same, dear, if you're not here with me. On the windows blue, snowflakes start falling. That's when those blue memories start calling. You'll be doing alright with your Christmas of wine, but I'll have a blue Christmas. And when those blue memories start falling, that's when those blue memories start calling. You'll be doing alright with your Christmas of wine. Oh, but I have a blue Christmas. What am I doing here, man?
I must say to the jury at this time, you've missed quite a show.
The foreperson, please stand. Has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes.
What is that verdict?
The jury unanimously decided that the author of Twas the Night Before Christmas is Henry Livingston Jr.
Mary! Oh my God!
Order! Order in the court. Order in the court. Let me ask the jurors, would you please stand? The verdict reported was that Mr. Livingston prevails. So say you all. Would anyone care to poll the jury?
I want the jury investigated.
Please be seated. Well, at this time, I want to thank the jurors for their service. You have been asked to do a noble thing, and based upon the evidence, you've made a decision today, and I commend you for your service. I would also like to thank the participants. I note that a lot of preparation went into this, and Mr. Casey, Ms. Casey, Mr. Jones, you're to be complimented for your decorum. I'm really gratified that in the course of these 2 hours, you have done nothing to destroy the integrity of Santa Claus, and I'm happy about that. At this time, I would like to introduce Duncan Crary, who put this whole thing together.
Wow. Thank you. I'm going to be busy tonight working on the press release to announce this verdict to the world tomorrow. Thank you all so much for coming. Paul Rabb had a great review of this event in the Metroland this Thursday. It's still on the shelves. And it said that he believes that the trial before Christmas could become the next great holiday event, like the Nutcracker, like A Christmas Carol. Only there's one thing that's different about this and those productions. And he said, this one's ours. It belongs to us here. And it does. I just wanted to invite you all to our after-trial party. It's next door on the second floor of the beautiful Troy Public Library. We have refreshments. We're going to have Pamela will be signing her books. We'll be selling all sorts of merchandise. This artwork was illustrated by hand by Ben Karasniks of Troy. So, you know, it's everything here. Greeting cards. Okay, so thank you. Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night.
The court is in recess. Thank you.
Tree won't be the same, dear, or if you're not here with me on the windows blue. Snowflakes start falling, let's windows blue. Memories start